It's hard to talk about spirituality without mentioning the word God. Now, the word God is very loaded and means different things to different people. In the West, already more than 100 years ago, Nietzsche have declared that God is dead, that we have killed him, whole murderers of all murderers. And with that gave birth to nihilism, existentialism, and a few other phenomena that our culture globally is really struggling with right now. But the quote doesn't end there. If you keep on reading, Nietzsche says, "Must we ourselves not become gods only to appear worthy of it?" Now, I'm not going to claim that I know what Nietzsche actually meant. He wrote in a somewhat obscured way that left the writings open to interpretation. And this is quite evident when we see that most modern scholars, although they have a very strong notion about the meaning of his work, tends in the same time to disagree with each other. So I suggest a different approach. We can instead look at the effects or the implications of his philosophy over the last 100 years or so. And when we do that, we can say that Nietzsche missed the mark big time. And still, in the same breath, he did manage to point us in the right direction. And that brings us to the topic of today, and the resurrection of God. Namaste, hello, and welcome. One of the things that we're endeavoring to do with Integral Tantrism is to find a new sense of meaning to life, the universe, and everything. And with that, we need to find new ways of integrating God back into our lives. Now, for those of you that already feels their stomach churning, please bear with me. I do not apply by any means that we need to regress to our old and somewhat childish anthropomorphic projections on divinity. Rather, that we need to take another step forward. This is important because we can clearly see that throughout the majority of human history, God or gods or divinity, which is a term that I much rather use, has been the main source for meaning and sense making. With the European Enlightenment, modernity, and the Age of Reason, we have upgraded our vision and understanding of the world in almost every area. However, religion and God have been left behind. As a result of that, with all the amazing benefits of modernity, we also gave birth to nihilism and the so-called death of God. To address that deficiency and that sense of void that started to appear in our lives, postmodernism, the next stage of development, tried to help us with the idea that we can create our own meaning. We do not need God or a creator as it was one thought. Essence does not precede being, rather, being precedes essence. This was a wonderful idea at the time that seemed to make a lot of sense on paper. However, after many decades of that meme running through our culture, we can see that unfortunately it came extremely short. Not only that it not provide us with a new sense of meaning and connection, instead it increased the sense of nihilism and disconnection, both on the individual level and the collective. And this is because, in its core, this idea dismantle any sense of grand narratives, which is the missing ingredient in our story for the next chapter. But before we get into what's next, what is God in an integral vision, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page and describe God as it's being perceived and experienced through the different stages of human development. As this is integral tantrism, we will use the integral meta-theory developmental map. In a simple version of this map, the rank or stages of development are usually called archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and then we make this monumental leap into a different tier of ranks and start to go into the integral domain. Each one of those levels of development, both on the individual aspect and the collective aspect, will give us a completely different perspective, experience, and understanding of God. The first stage is the archaic stage, and this is a pre-personal stage of development. It occurs somewhere between birth and the age of 2. And in this point, the baby or the infant still do not have the capacity to differentiate between themselves and the environment. The sense of self is not really developed yet. And they're pretty much preoccupied only with their own survival and sensory input. Because of that, it's a little bit challenging to extrapolate what God will be perceived from that level. However, as soon as we go to level 2, the stage which we call magic, we start to go into the egocentric domain. And this starts to occur somewhere around 18 months or 2 years up until the age of 6. At this stage, the individuals start to develop their own sense of self. And this is this point in development where babies learn that they can say no to everything. With that, the individual is still very much preoccupied with their own needs and desires and are not really able to take a second person perspective. They cannot see or put themselves in the shoes of others. One of the ways that this egocentric or the lack of capacity to take a second person perspective could be exemplified is with the game of peekaboo. We all know that babies get super excited when we play peekaboo with them. And has to do with the stage of development that they're in. Because when the parents brings the blanket up and cover their face, and the baby cannot see the parent anymore, from the baby's perspective, the parent is literally disappeared. They are not there. If they cannot see them, they don't exist. And because of that, when the blanket comes down and the parents appear again, it is so thrilling for the baby to see them there again because they just appeared out of nowhere. There is another example for something very similar where little children are trying to play hide and seek. They think that it's enough for them to cover their own eyes or cover their head with a blanket. And if they don't see you, it means that you cannot see them. On the collective level, when we look at cultures or societies which are in the magic stage, we also see that they are still very egocentric and self-absorbed. The name that is chosen for this stage is magic because of the inherent belief of the individual in their capacity to create magic. Magic in the sense that because I wish something or because I did something personally, this is the reason for everything else that's happening around me. A more concrete example of that could be in some more tribal culture that somebody wants rain to come, so they do a rain dance, and because they did the rain dance, the rain is coming. Or if there's a volcano eruption, the volcano is erupting because it's angry at me. Or on the other hand, maybe flowers are blossoming because I'm in love. And you see that there's constantly this narcissistic, self-absorbed perception of reality. Everything which is occurring around is always because of me. I am the center of attention and I'm not really able to perceive anything or anyone beside me. Now, I just want to make a small side comment. It's really important not to fall into a pre-trans fallacy over here. I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you already can feel your own connectivity to the whole and how your internal world and the external world around you, the way that you feel, your mind, your emotions, and the physical world around you, in some way they are connected. This is something else. This is a different level in the development that we will go into later on. But in this stage, we're still talking about something which is quite infantile, is quite narcissistic, is very much the belief that the whole universe is just revolving around me. That if I pass under, let's say, a ladder, or if a black cat just passed in front of me, this event is so significant because the universe cares only about me that everything will get reconfigured because I did this or because that specific event. It really have this obsessive aspect of selfishness. And we've seen this in movies like The Secret and a lot of trends in the New Age culture. Unfortunately, I think that we all know, or at least heard about people that speak about spirituality, that speak about higher consciousness and Gaia and connectivity, and so on and so forth. But you can see that they don't really have the capacity to really see the bigger picture and the connectivity. And what or where they're coming from is just very much their own egocentric needs. There is a high level of spiritual bypassing where we are using big words of connectivity and love and manifestation, so on and so forth, but we're only coming from that very egocentric stage. And as we go along with the different stages of development, I hope that that will become more clear how we can differentiate between this pre-stage, where we're still very egocentric and limited in our perspective, to those more higher stages of development where we can actually feel and come from that wider perspective of connectivity. The next stage is called mythic. And this is because one of the main ways that this stage of development is perceiving the world is through stories about power gods, great forces out there, and the literal belief in myth. This stage is an ethnocentric stage of development that usually develops in the individual somewhere between the age 6 and 12. Here, the sense of self starts to expand and it gains the capacity of taking a second person perspective. The identity of the individual expand from just their own perception of their own needs and sensations to the identity of the group or the social sphere that they are in. As the individual mature, they start to see that their own emotions do not make the world go round, that it doesn't matter how much they would wish for something, things will still occur in a different way. The fact that they close their eyes doesn't make the world disappear or not actually be there. But now this sense of grandiose, this sense of power is starting to be projected into the second person. So putting it in simple terms, maybe I cannot turn the yucky spinach into chocolate. It doesn't matter how much I want it. But mommy can. If I plead with mommy, if I be good boy, or if I do something to convince her, mommy or daddy are all powerful. They can change the world out there. And mommy, in this example, can turn the yucky spinach into chocolate or to whatever else that the child likes. When we look at it in a more cultural context, when we have a society that developed to this stage, usually what we see is a lot of worship to external idols that might do something for us. We can see the Roman, Greek, or Hindu pantheons of demigods, forces out there that I can bargain with in order to get my way in the world, forces that I can please so things will happen to me in the way that I want. Somebody is sick, I can make an offering, I can light a candle, put incense, break a coconut, do whatever ritual or sacrifice in order to appease that force and therefore get things my way. Another aspect of this stage of development could be exemplified with the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, a little side comment. It's important here to understand that it is not to say that by definition those religions or spiritual traditions are literal mythic. and rather that this was the time in human evolution and history that those religions and spiritual traditions were developed, and unfortunately where the majority of them are still are. And this is why the example makes sense. Nevertheless, it's good for us to know that there are new interpretations for those religions and spiritual traditions from higher stages of development. But now back to the example. To make this example a little bit more personal, I'm sure that we all have been at some point in a conversation with someone where we try to bring rational arguments about a certain topic, probably religion or spirituality. And doesn't matter what we say, the other person just doesn't get it. It seems that it's going over their head. We are showing facts, we're showing some rational arguments, and they just don't budge. And they don't see any contradiction between what they're saying, and the evidence. At that point, it is most probably that the person is not just dumb or stupid, but that capacity for seeing things in a rational way did not fully mature or develop in them. It really helps to have much more compassion, patience, and understanding when we see that it's not for a lack of trying that the other person doesn't engage in a conversation in a way which is satisfactory for us, rather that it has to do with a certain aspects of development. If you find yourself in conversation with a person that is in this mythical stage of development, and for the sake of argument, let's say that they believe in one of the monotheistic religions, if you try to make an argument against the idea that the world was created in 6 days or that the planet is 3,500 years old, by bringing evidence of evolution or the fossils from the dinosaurs, that kind of person most probably will just look you straight in the eyes and say, well, of course, God puts them there. And on the other hand, when you will ask them to provide some proof for their argument, they will say with a lot of confidence, of course, we have proof, we have facts. Here you can see, it says in the book, chapter 7, verse 13 said so and so. And they think that this is an actual rational argument and proof to what they're saying. Another very important aspect of this stage of development is that as we develop that second person perspective, we start to move from the egocentric, me perspective into the ethnocentric, us and we perspective. We start to see higher levels of care and empathy towards others and the group. However, that care and empathy is limited only to my group. And it really emphasizes this attitude of us versus them, something that is very prevalent in all fundamentalist and dogmatic religions. It is from that perspective that people believe that we have the truth, we are the chosen one, and everyone else are just sinners and infidels. God created the entire universe and chose only us as his true believers. God is all compassionate and benevolent. And if you misbehave, he will send you to hell to be tortured and burned for all eternity. The next stage of development is called the rational stage, and it comes with a world-centric perspective. And we can see it start to appear in individuals from the age of 12 into adulthood. At this point, the sense of identity is not so much derived only from the social group that one is part of, but there is a wider sense of global humanity and the connectivity and the equality between all people. A very important aspect is also the capacity to start to have more critical thinking on one's own perspectives and beliefs, as well as on others. As we developed from the first person perspective, I or me, into the second person perspective, us and we, now we're moving into the third person perspective, the it perspective. This is a rational, scientific, objective perspective. And just to make it a bit more relevant to our perception of God, we can see that from this new perspective, all this myth and belief before in God as a person in the sky are starting to seem very childish and immature. They're almost like when a child believed that Santa Claus is a real person that's going to come down the chimney. And when we move into this more rational capacity, sometimes we also start to develop a little bit more of cynicism or the need to burst the bubble when we hear this kind of mythic beliefs about God and religion. On a cultural or a collective level, we see this stage of development start to arrive around the 17th century. It appears in the form of the European Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, modernity, and the age of science and reason. In this stage, God as well starts to transform from a personal God, a humanoid God, a God that we project our own emotions and feelings on, and that have a personal relationship with us, watch our every action, into a more it perspective, into an objective perspective, into an impersonal type of God, so to speak. Instead of my God versus your God, or my God is the only God, God is starting to be perceived more as the universal laws that are governing the universe. Gravity, electromagnetisms, and the laws of physics. And in that place, sometimes even the word God doesn't really fit so much anymore, because as we mentioned, it's not a person or an entity or something specific and personal that does anything. We're talking about here universal laws, something that, let's say, metaphorically speaking, would be equivalent more to the force or something like this. Something which is completely impartial, but holds the entire universe together. Now, although this is not a personal God anymore that you can pray to that will do things for you, it is still God as a representative of universal laws. And because of that, it is still the main source for meaning, purpose, and ethics. A really great example of that could be seen in the United States Declaration of Independence from 1776. We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are imbued by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When we look at the rational stage of development and the perspective that it takes on God, this so-called third-person it perspective, the more rational scientific, as well as the morals and ethics, it's already a very inclusive vision. It's a very inspiring vision that gives room to whole humanity. Unfortunately, when we look at the world religions at large, putting aside a few specific mystics, we can see that most religions did not upgrade their own teachings and vision of the world from the literal mythic or magic stage into this rational stage, and thus started to create this growing chasm in society between people and cultures and the idea of God and spirituality. The chasm just keeps on growing larger and larger as we move into the late 19th and 20th century. And although some renowned scientists declare publicly their belief in God and talk about the connection between the mysteries of the universe, God, and science, the general public seems to not really feel that notion anymore. And that's probably because there are no renowned religious figures that are speaking in that rational language. Generally speaking, people become more skeptic and cynical when we talk about God. Religion become a thing of the past, is archaic, is dogmatic. and we start to experience the so-called death of God. What I'm trying to convey here in order to create an overarching theme about our relationship and perspective of what God is that although this rational stage of development brought us incredible progress in the fields of morals and ethics, calling for the end of slavery, women rights, and it also gave us a much more inclusive way to connect to God and the universe, this it perspective, those universal laws. When we see what actually happened, both on the individual level and on the collective level, as this stage of development it was starting to come to its end, is actually a growing sense of nihilism. Another aspect that was developing through this scientific perspective is the story of the mechanical universe. And because of that construction, people started to see life and reality as something which is completely deterministic or just happening at random. And because of that, the feeling of meaning, of why are we here, what are we doing, a sense of purpose to life started to get depleted and almost disappeared from our culture and from our hearts. The next stage of development is called the pluralistic stage, and it's considered to be cosmocentric. This is because the sense of identity, the ego, keep on expanding beyond the human world and identify or connect with something which is much more universal or connected to the cosmos. There is a deep sense of care for all living beings in all places, and a yearning also to connect to nature and to achieve more harmony. As we develop from the rational stage to the pluralistic stage, we go beyond the materialistic perspective on God and the universe, and we actually gain another perspective. We gain a fourth person perspective on the third one. So that's another perspective looking at science, another perspective out of the objective world looking at it. Here, we start to see that there isn't really such a thing as absolute true or objective truth. Everything is bound in context, and everything is actually very subjective. It is very hard to know any facts or things which are out there. The only thing that I can actually know is what's going on inside for me. And therefore, there is no more my God versus your God, or this is the true God and those are the false gods. All gods are true. I have my truth, you have your truth. All truths are just as valid. Instead of an objective world that we can actually discuss or even argue about, now the only thing that we have is a subjective world. Each person have their own interpretation of God, have their own experience of God, and nobody can doubt that, and you cannot argue about it. There is a growing sense of unity also between all those different visions. We hear things like all different spiritual paths are different routes going the same mountain, or the idea that all different spiritual teachers were all actually teaching the same deep message. Buddha, Jesus, Krishna, they're all representatives of the same godhood, or they're just teaching different aspects of the same truth. We see the rise of the perennial philosophy in the sense that there's a belief that all spiritual traditions throughout all history all meant the same thing, that all saints and sages realize the same truth, or at least the subjective understanding that absolute reality or God in its many forms basically appears in different ways to different people. Going deeper into that pluralistic or so-called postmodern perspective, God is being seen as a symbol, as a construct of culture, linguistic, and history. It is perceived more and more as a reflection of human values and aspiration, rather as some kind of a transcendent objective truth out there. This is a much more inclusive and embracive and much more flexible idea or vision of what God is. But as you probably already started to hear in the last descriptions of the relationship with God in this pluralistic postmodern stage, you can already see that also this stage, just like all the other before it, is not without its own shortcomings. If all truths are equally valid, what would we do when my truth conflicts with your truth? How would we derive our morals, ethics, and values? How do we know how to behave? Everything becomes subjective. How do we know how to worship, what to believe, what is right and what is wrong? There is no objective truth out there. There is only my internal experience. And as we see more and more, as much as this perspective is more embracive, is more inclusive, it also in the same time makes us feel more disconnected in the way. There is no inherent meaning to anything, and therefore everything becomes more nihilistic, cold, and disconnected. There are two other motives in this deconstructive stage of development. The first one is the tendency to regress into tribalism and to derive one identity from the group that it belongs to. The second one has to do more with this spiritual drive, and it's the deconstruction of spiritual traditions. This is where we see the New Age approach to spirituality. The idea that you can take all the world religions, deconstruct them, create a buffet, and then just pick and choose what is comfortable for you. When this approach first came to the scene around the early 70s, it was actually really inspiring and liberating, like every new stage of development that arrives. But after 30 to 50 years of this motive running through the culture, we're now seeing the downside and the shortcoming of this type of buffet approach to spirituality. Just like the first example, what seems to happen when people embrace that approach is a certain type of regression, going back into a magic belief of the world and a more narcissistic self-perception. All right, so now we finally arrived into the integral stage and the second tier of development. Now, before we can start to describe what God feels like, what does it look like from this level of altitude, it's important to know that integral is just the name of the first level of development in the second tier. After integral, there are other levels, more developed, more wide. There is even a whole other tier, the third tier of development. Now, as you can see, it all can get quite complex and have a lot of nuance. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm gonna simplify it and kind of like collapse all the different views that are coming from integral onwards. So this is to say that I just want you to keep in mind that whenever I'm talking about integral from now onwards, it might be something which is particular to that stage of development, or it might be something that coming from a level of development which is just after integral. The first thing that we see as we're moving into the second tier, and this is particular to the integral stage of development, that first stage in the second tier, is that we're moving from an either-or type of perception of reality into a both-and. We don't see anymore how everybody else is wrong and just our perspective is the correct perspective. We don't feel like we need to convert other people to leave their beliefs and join ours. We don't really think anymore that the world is a bad place because some people think and behave differently than me. Rather, we start to understand that all of those different perspectives and modes of operations are just expressions of certain level of altitude, a certain stage of development. And not only that it's okay that they're different, it is important that they are there. We cannot eliminate them. We see that all perspectives are valid, but now we also see them inside of a hierarchy of perspectives. We see more evolved perspectives, less evolved perspectives, but just like when we see people, we see younger people, older people. We don't think that all of a sudden we want to annihilate all young people because they're not evolved enough. We understand that, first of all, you need to be young in order to become older, right? And in the same way, we start to see the world in all the different perspectives. When we see a person which is dogmatic, which is fundamentalistic, which believes in the literal writing of the Bible, we don't think that anything is wrong with that person or in the world because of that person. We don't try to change their opinion or their view. Instead of that, we understand where they're at and how important it is that they go through that stage. And because of that, there is a shift in attitude. All of a sudden, there is a feeling of connection. We know how to speak to that person in their language without becoming condescending, truly going into their level and finding a sense of meaning and connection. However, the difference here from what we saw in the pluralistic stage, that also in some way embraced all perspectives as equally valid as and equally important, here, with the level of acceptance, there's also a sense of hierarchy. We understand that some things are less evolved, some things are more evolved, some things are less inclusive, some things are more inclusive. And we're able to see that trajectory of growth and development. When it comes to the way that we experience or think about God and what God means, this unique capacity that comes with the integral stage of development, the capacity to go down and up the ladder, so to speak, and to see each stage as absolutely necessary, is one of the important things that will allow us in turn also to start to really integrate and to see God and its light everywhere. The second thing that starts to happen from the second tier onwards, when we go into integral and beyond, is that we develop our capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. And this is very important when it comes to our spiritual practice and our perception of God. As we go through development, we start in a pre-rational stage where we don't even have the capacity for rationality. We move into a rational mode of being where everything makes sense, hopefully. And then we can also push it beyond that and to go into a trans-rational stage, something which is including rationality, so we don't fall into the pre-trans fallacy. It's not irrational. It's including rationality, but it's able to go beyond that. It might appear paradoxical, but you can see that it's both end. There is truth in multiple perspectives. And although they might seem to contradict each other, they somehow coexist in harmony. This is a capacity which is very difficult to explain or to talk about. But we can see that throughout the ages, saints and spiritual teachers try to point us to something which is going beyond our binary way of thinking, going beyond the rational mind. Again, it's not nonsense, it's not irrational, it's not just purely contradicting. There is sense, but there is an appearance of not even contradiction. The mind just gets stuck. We cannot really penetrate with the dualistic thinking to that domain, but we're able to experience it. And we can find a way to make sense out of it. This unique capacity has to do with developing the organ of knowledge that in the traditions is used to be referred as the heart. Learning how to know and understand the world, learning how to make sense with your heart. Now, I know that if you didn't really experience that or develop that stage of development, this could sound a little bit wishy-washy. But I really want to inspire you, hopefully, to try to open up into this. This is this mystical domain, this trans-rational domain, the domain of the heart that all the mystics and poets talked about throughout millennia. And it is crucially important for us to lean into that domain in order to be able to actually perceive the world in a non-dualistic way, seeing both duality and non-duality in a holistic vision of monism. As we're putting all of this together, our vision and perspective of what God is becomes much more holistic. It is not anymore reduced into one particular view from one particular lens. We're not looking at God only from a literal mythic place. We do not look at God only from a rational stage as the laws of the universe. We do not look at God as some mental construct or social construct, as a subjective interpretation of something. Rather, we learn how to integrate all of those perspectives to something much more holistic. We integrate the third person it perspective, God as the Buddha nature or the laws of the universe. We integrate the second person perspective, where we see God in a relational manner. And we integrate the first person I perspective, seeing God in the heart as the essence of our being. And as we do that, a profound shift happens from within. Regardless in what culture we grew up in, we do not see anymore or do not experience anymore God as an external force out there. God is not a craftsman or a potter that creates the world as an artifact. So we have God the creator and the world as the creation. We come to a place where we see that there is no separation between the so-called creator and the creation. The creation is the creator itself. The whole relationship starts to shift as a place where God is experiencing itself through you, seeing the world through your eyes. When that happens, a profound transformation starts to occur. God is being perceived and experienced as a beam of light going through a prism, expressing itself or manifesting itself in a multiple of lights and colors. And you, as a spectrum of this light, is none other than God, the universal consciousness itself, dividing itself into the multiplication of manifestation to experience itself through the unique perspective of you. Everything around you and yourself included is none other than that Godhead. All different aspects, different facets of the same divinity. When that stage of development is being experienced, it is evident that God is not someone out there, is not a person with likes and dislikes. And therefore, any kind of conversation or argument about what God can or cannot do, what is his personality, and so on, seem completely irrelevant. God now is being rediscovered as the most universal, yet the most intimate. God is being experienced as the sacred spark in the heart, the essence of your being, and who you truly are. Thus, when we speak about God in Integral Tantrism, we are pointing to something which is completely universal, yet extremely intimate and personal. Is that sense of self that endlessly expanding both outwards and inwards, including everything in manifestation, in existence, in the universe and beyond, pointing to that point in the heart, your most intimate nature, calling you to awaken and remember who you truly are. And with that, resurrecting and giving birth to God. Om.